Hi everyone, welcome to your very last lesson here in world history. Can you believe we're here? Seemed like we'd never get here. Today we're going to talk about the Russian Revolution. We're going to look at how Russia went from being an entity controlled by a czar, moving all the way up to a total control of a totalitarian dictator named Joseph Stalin. So make sure you're in your interactive notebook for the last time and you're following along. All right, let's go ahead and get started for the last time again. I know you're not sad probably, but we're on page 8 of your interactive notebook. And again, today we're talking about the Russian Revolution. Let's start off as always with our essential question. So how did long-term social unrest in Russia explode in revolution and usher in the first communist government? We're going to go through and dive in with this last episode. Hey, it's the last one, so why not? I know. Sit back, relax, make sure you enter this in. But let's start off talking about the czars. So you'll remember we talked way back when we talked about our absolute rulers. Russia was ruled by what were known as czars, which is a Russian term meaning basically Caesar. But in 1881, Alex III became czar, and he ended all reforms of the different czars prior to him. He instituted autocratic rule, or meaning I'm the only one in charge, and suppressed all opposition, all dissent. He created government control of any written criticism. So anyone that is criticizing him, he is censoring it. He also had secret police go in and monitor schools. So again, this guy was like, hey, it's my way or the highway. Any non-Russians living in Russia were treated very harshly, and Jews became the target of government-backed pogroms. And pogroms is just mob violence. From here, in 1894, Nicholas II becomes czar, and he continues the autocratic ways or the absolute control that Alex III had instituted in his reign. Russia is going to also be in that industrialization train that we talked about in the previous episode. The number of factories grows between 1863 and 1900. They double, in fact, but Russia is still severely lagging behind the rest of Europe. By the late 1800s, though, one of the higher ups in Russia comes up with a new plan, and it boosts steel production, and they have a major railroad that is created throughout Russia. The Trans-Siberian Railway is produced, so that really helps industrialization and kind of helps them kind of pick up the slack where they were lagging behind. However, industrialization breeds discontent over working conditions, wages, similar things that we were seeing in other countries revolving around, the idea of revolution as well as industrialization. We do have a growing popularity in Marxist ideas. This guy, Karl Marx. Marx came up with the idea with Friedrich Engels that there at some point in time, the proletariat, as they were called, this is like the working class, is going to rise up and overthrow the czars or their government, and they would eventually rule. So a lot of people start to get behind this idea because, again, there are so many people at this time period in Russia that are part of that working class. We have a radical group, the Bolsheviks. They split from these Russian Marxists. They split into two groups. One are the Mensheviks and one are the Bolsheviks. The Bolsheviks being the more radical of the two groups. And again, they're, as I said, going to be Marxists. They're going to favor revolution by a very small, committed group. And they are going to ultimately be led by a gentleman by the name of Vladimir Lenin. Like I said, he's a Bolshevik leader, very excellent at organizing, a very inspiring leader. We're going to see different crises at both in the domestic area of Russia as well as abroad that kind of builds and builds and builds, and that kind of explodes, as we said, into this Russian Revolution. First, we had the Russo-Japanese War, or the Russian versus Japanese War. They are going to be defeated in this in the early 1900s, and again, that feeds into that unrest in Russia. We also have something known as Bloody Sunday that happens in 1905, or the Revolution of 1905. Over 200,000 workers marched on the Tsar's palace, and they demanded reforms surrounding working conditions, pay, you name it. Unfortunately, the army decided to fire into the crowd, killed a lot of people, and the massacre led to widespread unrest. And Nicholas II is forced to make reforms after this. They institute something known as the Duma. It was Russia's first parliament, and they're going to meet in 1906 for the first time. The Tsar was unwilling to share power, so actually he actually dissolves the Duma after 10 weeks. So he didn't even give him a chance. He was all about that autocratic rule. And so again, this is feeding into that civil unrest, or the unrest of the people, that they're craving this revolution. Finally, we have World War I. This is kind of as it says, the final blow, or if you want to call it the straw that broke the camel's back. This is that popular saying. At the time, World War I was raging on. Russia was a part of it, and there were heavy losses with all countries, but Russia was kind of getting nailed a lot during World War I. And it's really revealing the weaknesses of the government with their participation in World War I. Nicholas goes down to the war front, and while he's gone, his wife, Alexandra, she runs the government, or the Tsarina. Hopefully I pronounced that right. She runs the government. She, at the time, falls under the influence of a guy named Rasputin. Rasputin was this mysterious holy man that came in, said he was going to be an advisor to the royal family. Kind of a really creepy dude. We're not going to get into him, but look him up on your own. The nobles in Russia really feared his influence, so much so that they actually had him murdered. They felt that he wasn't going to provide the best advice and influence to the royal family. So he is a weird, strange dude. So like I said, definitely look that up on your own. But back to World War I, the army was losing its effectiveness in World War I, and people at home were both hungry and unhappy. So, any war that you're involved in, if the citizens aren't backing the war, it's going to lead to some problems. So again, during this time period with all these other things building up, World War I is not helping things. So then we have a couple internal revolutions that kind of lead to the big revolution where, the Russians decide to take over. So in March of 1917, we have more strikes. Soldiers are refusing to fire on workers. And we have the March Revolution. Protests ultimately become uprisings, and Nicholas actually abdicates the throne. He actually flees for his life. The Duma is established, like a provisional one, kind of temporary. There's no official government, but they're just kind of there as a placeholder. And then we have the Soviets that come in, a committee of socialist revolutionaries, and they control most of the cities throughout Russia. By April of 1917, the Germans get wind, the World War I is still taking place. Germans get wind of what's happening in Russia, and they decide to help Lenin, who had been exiled some years before. They kind of decide they want to kind of force Russia out of the war because it's going to eliminate an opponent. So they kind of get into contact with Lenin. They're like, all right, look, we're going to get you back into Russia, and then you're going to do some stuff for us to help us out with World War I. So the Germans aid Lenin in returning from exile in Russia, and that leads us into the Bolshevik Revolution. So November of 1917, the workers ultimately take control of the government like they had wanted to. Lenin gives land to the peasants. He puts workers in control of the factories, and the Bolsheviks sign a treaty with Germany. Ultimately, they pull Russia out of the war, and so again, that helps Germany. Ultimately, Germany isn't successful in World War I, but at this point in the war, it was very helpful for them that they came out. This leads to civil war in Russia. We had the Bolsheviks' Red Army versus a very loosely aligned White Army. The White Army was made up of different groups that opposed the Red Army. They were people who wanted to reinstitute a czar to control the government, possibly a democratic government, possibly a socialist government. So again, they're not all completely on board with each other, the White Army, but they're enough that, it's like they're all fighting a common enemy. So they go up against the Bolsheviks. Ultimately, though, the Red Army wins. There's a 3-year war after the Bolshevik Revolution, and it leaves over 14 million dead in Russia. Lenin ultimately comes in and helps to restore order. So by March of 1921, he launches the NEP, or the New Economic Policy, which has some elements of capitalism, but it ultimately comes in with peace. It restores the economy that was shattered by the war and this revolution. So they're trying to pick up the pieces and put Russia back together under this newly, what's the word I want to say? Newly formed government, I guess. I lost my train of thought. So by 1928, though, farms and factories are becoming productive again in Russia. Lenin does create a self-governing set of republics under a national government. By 1922, they actually rename the country. So it's no longer going to be known as Russia. It'll be known as the USSR, or the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. So when you were talking about World War II, probably back last year in social studies in your junior year, you're probably like, what in the heck is the USSR? It came out of this time period. It was around during World War II. And then after the fall of communism, it goes away and comes back to Russia. So that's where that comes from. The Communist Party, as I said, comes in and takes over in Russia as well. It is a new name taken by those Bolsheviks. And again, they're pulling from Karl Marx. Karl Marx always proposed this classless society that came after workers would seize power. So again, Marx was kind of prophesizing this, and these Bolsheviks made it happen. Lenin actually has a stroke in 1922, so he's taken out of power. He doesn't die in 1922, but his power is reduced, and Leon Trotsky and Joseph Stalin come up. They're going to compete to replace Lenin. Joseph Stalin, he was a very cold, hard Communist Party follower. His name was different. I'm not going to try and pronounce it or write it for you because it's super long and crazy Russian. But he does change his name to Joseph Stalin because Stalin meant man of steel. And this guy lived up to his name. He gains more and more power between 1922 and 1927. Lenin did not like Stalin. He felt he was a dangerous man. Unfortunately, he's not able to really voice his opinion too much after 1924 because he does die in 1924. And Stalin goes on in 1928 to gain complete control of Russia. Trotsky is forced into exile. He eliminates his competition. And Stalin goes on to rule a totalitarian government in Russia. And we'll see him, as I said, in World War II. But we're not going to talk about that here. So that, in a nutshell, is the Russian Revolution. Make sure this is in your interactive notebook. And that's a wrap on World History in Dr. Pro's class. Thank you for tuning in and paying attention to all these lessons. We'll see you sometime in the future, maybe. See ya.